Welcome to the Theotherapist Podcast, where theologically trained, licensed therapists share health and healing conversations. Join our host, Dr. Catrice Glenn, for conversations about real-life issues from both theological and therapeutic perspectives. Each week, we speak to guiding questions with real-life application, humor, and engaging guests to share meaningful dialogues with our listeners. Let's begin.
Welcome to the 6th episode of the Theotherapist Podcast. We're so glad that you're joining us today. Today I have one of my very, very special friends joining me on the podcast, the Reverend Dr. Jaye Lynn Peabody Smith. Now that's a mouthful. Dr. Smith, I'm so happy that you are joining me. There are so few of us who have the passion and the enthusiasm that we do for mental health and for ministry and the collaboration and integration of them both. I'm ecstatic that Jaye is with me today, and I'm just thankful for it. So I want to tell you a little bit about Jaye before she jumps in. Reverend Dr. Jaye Peabody Smith is a licensed professional counselor, and she has her own practice. It's the Peabody Practice, which provides counseling, consultation, and training for individuals and organizations. She, like myself, has a Master's of Divinity in Pastoral Counseling, and she has a Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health, as well as a DMin, a Doctor of Ministry in Pastoral Counseling, all from Mercer University. But in addition to that, she trumps me with a third master's in public administration with a concentration in nonprofit administration. She's certified anger management specialist, certified pastoral counseling supervisor, and as well as that, she is in ministry. She's been in ministry for over 20 years. She's ordained AME, but right now she serves as the executive pastor of Redemptive Life Christian Fellowship in Conyers, Georgia. For those of you out there who are definitely a part of the Pell Hellenic, did I say it right? Yes, I think. She is a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and has also served as the Southern Regional Chaplain for the last 4 years between 2016 and 2020. One more thing to know about her, in addition to the long list of other things that she's active in, she also wrote a book. She wrote a book called The Heels, Hearts, and Halos, Lessons on My Journey. That's available on Amazon. She created in 2020 a space called My Sacred Space. I'm going to let her talk more about that in a little bit. But with all of those accolades, with all of those accomplishments, Theotherapist Podcast, let's just welcome Reverend Dr. Jaye Peabody Smith. Thank you so much for being here today. How are you today?
I am wonderful, and I appreciate you having me here and creating this space for us.
Definitely. Wow. Can you tell us a little bit about the nonprofit you created in 2020?
Sure. My Sacred Space was or is an organization to help those that can't afford to pay for counseling services. So I will negotiate with other counselors in the field, and through people's donations, we're able to provide sessions for those who are either uninsured or underinsured, meaning their insurance doesn't really provide the coverage for them to get mental health services. So it is, my passion has always been serving the underserved. And so we created My Sacred Space to do that, and also to provide education about mental health so that we can help reduce the stigma.
Oh, that's so necessary, right? Oftentimes we run into so many people who would go into mental health spaces and get help, but there are financial issues or perhaps some things that prohibit them from just walking through the door. And I think anything we can do to try to eliminate some of the borders, the boundaries, the hindrances, I think those are important. So I'm so glad that that's out there. I can't wait to get more information about that so I can share with others as well. And we're going to give you information on how to connect with Dr. Peabody Smith later on. But know that she has a website, and tell the folks, you can go ahead and tell the folks what your website is now so that they can find you.
Sure. It's www.thepeabodypractice.com.
Gotcha. www.thepeabodypractice.com. So, I have run into Jay in many different circles. We both went to Mercer for our MDivs. And so, of course, we've crossed paths there. We both also completed, our master's in counseling there. And so oftentimes we've been in spaces to have either some conversation or at least, bounce some things off every now and then, even if we're not right in front of each other. And so I'm curious to you, Jay, when you think about integrating theology and therapy, how do you see that intersection point?
Well, there is so many ways. It's two of the things that I love that I'm able to bring together. And when I think of therapy, I guess what some call like psychodynamic. I use a lot of object relations and kind of meaning that when we're born, we are born perfect and good, not from a theology perspective, but just, if you hold a baby and you look at a baby, that baby is perfect and good. And that's really what they know until life teaches them something else. And so oftentimes in therapy, what we're doing is going back and rewriting the narrative that life has given us. And so I bring spirituality into that because we're rewriting that narrative with who God says you are and what God's truth is for your life. And so to me, it's like taking these two really powerful tools and just bringing them together so that people can become our best selves.
Isn't that the important part, right? To connect those dots so that we can realize and actualize who we were created to be and kind of how we are intended to be. So your passion areas, tell me more about your passion areas and kind of how those intersect with, your understanding of spirituality and therapy.
Sure. So I have a huge passion for areas around forgiveness and relationship and dealing with shame. And forgiveness has been the one that I have done a lot of work around, partly because I have learned how to forgive. Like I am one of those preachers. I'm not going to preach what I don't practice. Right. So I always say I'm not going to preach or teach about patience or being on time because those aren't things I'm really good at. But I know what it is to forgive. I had some tough things happen when I was growing up. I was sexually assaulted when I was in college. My first marriage was very unhealthy. And I've learned to forgive in all of that. And when I got into the excitement of forgiveness, it's something I began to preach about or teach about. And the one common denominator afterwards would be like, that was really great, but you didn't tell me how to forgive. And so that is where I wanted to really focus my research on. The other thing that would come up is that if somebody was unable to forgive, they would then pull themselves back from God. Not that God ever left them, but they would have this idea that because I'm unable to forgive, I'm not a quote unquote a good Christian or God is disappointed with me. And that was heartbreaking for me. One of my favorite texts in the Bible is the Pharisees and the tax collector, where the Pharisees does everything and he's, loving himself. The tax collector is, I'm a sinner. But what's interesting in the text is that the tax collector doesn't even come close to the temple and he's looking down. And I think that's what happens when we can't be who we think God wants us to be. We have this shame that pulls us away from God. And so I really wanted to help people kind of navigate that circle.
Oh, and that's such a space that we all find ourselves in, right? Every human at some point tends to cross that journey or cross that path. That's why today's podcast is focused on forgiveness. And asking kind of one of those seminal questions, why do I need to be the one to forgive? Why do I need to forgive? That's often a question that many of us have either encountered or we ponder. Because we hear out in the world, you need to forgive, you need to forgive. You may have heard it from your church context. You may have heard it from social media. You may have heard it from a relative, but it always seems as though there's some onus on us to forgive and not that there's a power in forgiveness. And so today we want to talk about that because forgiveness is not, as you know, about the other person. It's about us. It's about what's going on inside of us, what's happening in our mind, our heart, and our spirit. And so, one of the guiding questions I wanted to leave kind of in the backdrop of what we're talking about today is, what difference does it make to forgive? Like many people are pondering, this horrible thing happened to me, or this thing that I really didn't like happened to me, or I feel betrayed, or I feel like someone broke my trust. I feel like someone mistreated me, or a situation mistreated me. And I don't know that I want to let it go. I don't know why I need to let it go. What difference would forgiveness make in the first place? And so, in the backdrop of our conversation, I'm hoping that that guiding question kind of leads us through some of the discussion that we're having today. When you hear those particular types of questions, what comes up for you?
So I do hear that one a lot. Like, why should I forgive? And I've all heard the reason why before, that anger only hurts the host, that forgiving frees us, not necessarily the other person, that we don't want to be a hypocrite, right? Because the Bible says that we have to forgive others for, God to forgive us. And I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I still sin pretty often. So I kind of need that forgiveness that God has given us. But the challenge becomes, especially with the church, I think we do a disservice when we give this idea that it happens just like that, right? That we forgive and we're supposed to do it very quickly. And it's not. If forgiveness is indeed a process, there's a difference between emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness. Decisional is, yes, I forgive. Sure. Emotional forgiveness is really being able to release the anger and the resentment and the hurt behind the act that you're forgiving. So in general, people will say, why? I think most of us get why, but it's difficult. It's still difficult. And that's where what I learned is that there are many barriers to forgiveness, right? And so when you ask somebody, what are the barriers, right? So when someone says why, and we say, well, why not? Those tend to be the barriers. Well, that person doesn't deserve my forgiveness. You're absolutely right. We didn't deserve it when God forgave us. Or if I forgive, it's like letting them off the hook. No, it's letting us off the hook from all of that pain and that anger. Or I'm waiting for them to apologize. Well, most of us are waiting for apologies we're never going to get. And some of it is sometimes people don't even know that they've hurt us or that there's a reason that we're looking for their forgiveness, especially if we haven't communicated it. So there are, all of these different barriers. Even if we understand, there are some reasons, there's some things that are stopping us from doing so.
Right. And I think it's often, an internal battle. Usually we're not sharing with others kind of this unforgiveness we're holding on to. It's just kind of something we're seething over or ruminating, if you want to use a therapy word, something we're cycling through. And either we get triggered and it comes back to us, or we see that person and it comes back to us. We have a memory and it comes back to us, but it just keeps kind of living as a residual in our life. And we're acting as though we're the only one, that's ever had to deal with some unforgiveness like this. I'm wondering also, like, does harboring that hurt and that pain, have a real effect on us?
Oh, I mean, in so many ways, there's kind of this implode where we keep it in because we think that it doesn't bother us. But it comes out mostly in our relationships and our inability to trust and our inability to be vulnerable. It comes in physical pain because think of it as this energy that we're holding on to. And so then we get this back pain and these headaches or, these irritability, and we're not really sure where it's even coming from. So oftentimes we like to say, it doesn't bother me. I'm not going to think about it, but it does impact us.
It does. And I think, if we could be honest with ourselves, there's some residuals that are affecting not only our physical body, but our mental space, our mind, the way we have relationships with other people. All of these things can be impacted because we're still holding on to something that, we felt in the past, or we felt like we either didn't see coming or we couldn't prevent. And so sometimes that becomes another barrier to why our life is still being impacted by forgiveness. One of the things that I often ask my clients is usually kind of to give me a history of understanding a scenario of what happened, but also understanding, not for the sake of condoning anything, but to try to understand multiple perspectives of what might have happened in a situation. Right.
Right.
Like also as a child who had a parent with a somewhat difficult, upbringing, then, it helped me as an adult to understand a little bit more about who that person was. Like, how did they get to be who they were? It didn't mean that, I necessarily had to forgive them because they had, a certain background, but it definitely gave me a lot of perspective. And that perspective said, okay, perhaps what's going on in them had more to do with what happened to them than their
Yes. And
intentionality to hurt me.
absolutely. So I always say, that saying that hurt people hurt others and broken people will break others. And they don't necessarily do it on purpose, right? That idea of God forgive them for they know not what they do. Sometimes they don't know how their pain has caused them to interact. It's not an excuse, but it does allow you to have some compassion, which helps you to forgive. So I use the example of when the person that raped me. Rape is all about control, right? That's why you have children as young as 2 to saints as 102. It's not about what you have on or any of that. It's about that person needing control. And for someone to need control, it means that in their life, somebody took control from them. So I can recognize that that person from their own pain needed to control me because they had not dealt with their own brokenness. Doesn't make it okay, but it does allow me to understand that it necessarily wasn't about me.
Right.
There is a quote that says, forgiveness is an act of love, not justice. It's an act of love, not justice. And the love is really for yourself and for your relationship with God. So when I preach about it, I use the thieves that were at the cross with Jesus. And, that one thief, he came in, talking bad about Jesus too. And when he saw how Jesus responded, he was like, well, wait a minute, maybe this is the Son of God. And so he was like, hey, Jesus, don't forget about me. Right. And Jesus said, today you will be me in paradise. That's the love. The justice was he still had to die. He didn't get off the cross. He still had to deal with the consequences. The person who assaulted me still had to go to jail. Still had to deal with the consequences. Me forgiving does not release from the consequences. But again, it's an act of love for myself and for my relationship with God. And so when I think about how difficult it is to forgive somebody, but God forgives us just like that, it makes me fall in love with God even more.
And the fact that God reaches out to us, even in those dark spaces, right? To try to reaffirm that space of love.
Yep. I think that's where, we find God the most is in our brokenness.
And that kind of leads me to my next thought. And my next question is, will God still love me even if I'm struggling with forgiveness, even if I'm struggling to forgive someone?
And so that is really, I think, what kind of ignited my desire to do some of this work, because particularly in the church, you're hearing somebody preach, forgive, forgive, forgive. And if you're struggling, well, what does that say about me as a Christian? And again, people then take on, well, maybe I'm not such a good Christian. Or maybe they start, trying to serve more, do more, trying to earn that, even though that's not what God expects of us. And so again, God doesn't pull away from us, but we tend to pull away from God because we're in this mentality that we're not doing this rule of forgiveness when really the forgiveness is more about relationship than it is about rules. I think what I learned in this research, what I did not realize in the beginning, is that the biggest challenge in forgiving somebody else is that we have not forgiven ourselves. Absolutely. So I say that shame is a trick of the enemy, right? There is something that we have not forgiven ourselves for, which makes it difficult to then forgive someone else, even though God has already, forgiven us. One of the best stories that I love to share, and a client has, given me permission to do this. She actually shares it now, but she was a beautiful young woman that went to a very prestigious type university. She grew up with very low self-esteem, felt like she was never good enough for her mom. And so I always say that falling in love and low self-esteem is a horrible combination, right? So she fell in love with somebody who would begin to take care of her, make sure she had money for school. And then long story short, he asked her to do something that she wasn't comfortable doing. He's like, but if you love me. And really what happened is he eventually pimped her out. She became a victim of human sex trafficking. And she could not leave because he said if she did, that he would tell her mother what she's been doing. Well, her mother died, and the guy, quote unquote, let her go to their mother's funeral. And that's when she escaped. And so now she's coming to counseling because she wants some semblance of life back. And she talks about how she can't even go to Walmart because she's afraid that she might run into somebody who used to pay to have sex with her. And so we did a lot of work about, you make mistakes out of your brokenness, but you're not a mistake. And so eventually she was able to forgive herself. And she's like, if somebody comes up to me now and they're like, she can say, yeah, but look what God has done. And this is my testimony. And so that's kind of the power of being able to forgive. And kind of going back to that Pharisees and the tax collector, Jesus said it's the tax collector that is going to be humbled and exalted. And so it is being able to own our brokenness that God can move even more. But again, we get caught up in the shame, which then stops us from living the life that God wants us to live.
Yeah, shame, I think, in some ways creates this really destructive barrier to self-love. Loving on self, appreciating self, and affirming self. And that shame is corrosive. It's just a detriment to who we are, because the only intention of shame is guilt, is judgment. It doesn't do anything that's life-giving. Everything is about extracting life from you. And, that's not what God intends for us.
That shame is often connected to our own brokenness or our own trigger. And that's why it might be easy for one person to forgive something and for another not to. Like if, somebody said, you know what, Jay, you're a horrible mother. I'd be like, okay, because it wouldn't impact me. I know that I'm a great mother, right? So I can forgive you for that. But if you tap into my brokenness, it becomes harder. Right. So, I tell people I grew up being told that I was stupid and ugly, and I was, a homecoming queen. I was in gifted programs, but I didn't believe any of it until I was in my 30s, after I went to therapy, which is why I became a therapist. But if you even hinted that I was stupid, or I thought that you thought I was stupid, I would either shut down or I would be ready to fight. I was a little bit of a thug back in the day. And so that was my brokenness. So if somebody did something to me around that made it harder for me to forgive. So, of course, I look back at all these degrees and had to wonder, did I do that to show the world I wasn't stupid, which in hindsight, now I got all these loans, it's stupid. But if Jesus came to me today,
for the greater good.
Yeah, right. If Jesus came to me today was like, you know what, Dr. J, you're stupid. I'd be like, look, I know you're the son of God and all, but you got that one wrong, because I know what I know. So oftentimes what stops us from forgiving is something that we have to reconcile within ourselves. Right. So I encourage clients to make a list, right, of the people that you need to forgive. At first people are like, oh my God, it's going to be so long. But actually, as you go through it, it ends up not. You realize I'm not even thinking about that anymore. And in the second column, you're going to write, well, what did that person do to me? And then in the third, you're going to write, how did it make me feel about myself? And if there's something that comes up more than once, like by doing that, they made me feel like I'm less than, then that less than is a part of your brokenness. And when you begin to heal that, it helps in your ability to forgive.
Definitely. That's powerful. That's powerful.
Yeah, and I did not know that when I started the research. It was kind of this commonality of, just doing the work. And that's one of the things that came out of the research.
And when you find that you work with clients and they kind of walk this forgiveness journey, like you said, it's very rarely an instant. Like, okay, I decide today I'm going to forgive, and now, all is forgiven. I've moved on with life. Usually it's a process. It's a journey, right? That process healing. And so in that process healing journey, are there kind of places or benchmarks that you can see along the way, or does it just kind of go from, hey, one day you just realize and actualize, hey, I think I'm in a space where I can live in forgiveness for this?
Mhm. To be honest, I think it's like a roller coaster. Like one day you think you got it, and then something happens, and you're kind of right there again until you're able to work through it. And I always say forgiveness doesn't mean that it doesn't impact you. It's just not in the same way, right?
Right.
You're able to release that anger or that desire for revenge, and you're able to see what about this bothers you so much, and how it's really more about that person, that people do what they do because of who they are, not because of who we are. And again, I always say it's a process, because you have to start, and then sometimes you got to start again. But at some point, you do make that choice to forgive. The other thing is that I compare it to that analogy of like a wound, where you have a cut or a wound and it heals, and you look down and there's a scar. So you never forget. It just doesn't hurt as much. So this idea of forgiving and forgetting is not even, doesn't even exist. It's not possible. You're not going to forget the traumatic experience, but you will be able to let go of the hold that it has on you.
Right. And, I want to kind of end with a question. I do a lot of couples counseling. And so there's an additional layer to this, working through that forgiveness journey when you have the space and the time to do it, and you're not there in front of the person that triggers you, is one thing. But what about when you live with them? What about when you still have day-to-day interactions and you've got to navigate difficult relationships while still trying to journey toward forgiveness? We have so many couples that struggle with internal issues of forgiveness. And then you've got mothers and daughters, you've got siblings, you've got cousins, you've got auntie nims. Thanksgiving, I know, is a huge trigger for forgiveness, as well as Christmas, because you have all these gatherings with people who potentially are triggering that unforgiveness. And so just what are your thoughts, when you have to live with these ongoing relationships and work on forgiveness?
It's hard to heal in the place that hurt you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it comes down to making that decision and that person in that decision with you. So, we see a lot of infidelity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell the person that was cheated on that this has nothing to do with you. It's really them, right? So how can we, one, build back trust? What can this person do to build back trust? And then the person that stepped out, we got to figure out, well, what was that about for you?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we heal whatever that brokenness was that caused that to happen? In that scenario, though, you have two people who are willing to work together on that forgiveness process, right? What might be a little bit different is when that's not the case. And really in both, sometimes you have to ask yourself that question, or tell yourself your partner is not your problem. It's what they're triggering in you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when I look at my first marriage, it was very unhealthy. I don't blame it all on him, because the reality is I didn't have any self-esteem. And so I married someone that kind of represented what I thought about myself. And then I had to then realize at some point, this is about me. And then when I became whole, what was going on didn't work anymore. And so in that situation, I can forgive, but I can't stay.
Right.
So not everyone deserves a front row seat in your life. Some get a front row, some get a back, some don't get in the building. As children, we don't have those choices as much, but as adults, we do. And if that other person is not willing to journey with you and to grow with you, you might have to kind of find either a different person or take that journey by yourself for a while, which actually was really fun and then I met my new husband, 5 years now, but because I was in a better place, because I was good, I was able to connect with someone who was going to be good to me. So it's not always easy. And the other thing that I hear is that, well, the Bible says I have to honor my mother and father. Okay, but we can go into the theological understanding of what that means, right? This is why it's great to be duly trained, because you can kind of explain what the context about that really was. Really had a lot to do with names and lineage and bringing honor to the name. It wasn't the idea that somebody abuses me and I'm supposed to be okay with it, right? So again, even with family, sometimes we got to make tough choices. Forgiveness does not mean that trust is restored. Mm-hmm. Trust is earned. And in forgiving somebody, it means that they have earned your trust again, because really they have broken trust with you, and they have broken their trust in what God has asked them to do. So they have to be willing to build that trust back. And if they don't, it's not because you're not worth it. It's because whatever it is, reason with them. But then you have some tough decisions to make.
Because they're making choices, and so should you.
Absolutely.
You know, this is such a rich conversation, as most of ours are, and we could go on for hours and hours and hours, particularly on this subject. But I'm just so thankful we got a chance today to at least start the dialogue. Oftentimes, when I'm working with clients and questions of forgiveness come up, you know, they're dealing with residuals of some anger or some frustration, some bitterness, resentment. And those are the things that are filtered kind of into their day-to-day being. They may not recognize it as that, but then, you know, when they realize I see my whole worldview from a more negative place now, then a part of that is bringing that to the surface and going, well, is there something in there? Is there something that's motivating this, that perhaps is creating that dark space for you? And where can we find the light? Like, where can we look for light so that we can kind of get you back closer to the light? Go toward the light, Carol Lynn, go toward the light. And so, I would ask kind of as a last question on this topic, in all that you've researched and all that you've worked with, what would be that one thing you want someone who is struggling with forgiveness to hold on to and to start their journey with?
I think going back to that message or that question, what did what they do? What does that make me feel about myself? And be introspective enough to deal with that. It's easier to be angry with somebody else. But behind anger is pain, fear, rejection. I can't do anything about them, but I could live my best life if I understand how I can be healed. If I hadn't gone through this healing process, I probably would be afraid to, go outside. I wouldn't be able to have a great co-parenting relationship. So really, forgiveness is about me, and allowing me to let go of those things that stop me from being my best self and being everything that God has for me. It's right. It's not easy. That person probably doesn't deserve your forgiveness. The crazy thing is they may have asked God and God forgave them, and we still over here being mad. Who knows? We can't do much about them. But if we walk with and abide with God, there's so much that we can do to grow for within us.
Ooh. Profound words. I want to thank the Reverend Dr. Jaye Lynn Peabody Smith for being with me today. I had to call all your government names out. So thankful for you being here. This has been such a rich conversation. My hope and my prayer is just going to bless so many folks. Please let them know how they can find you on your socials and your website, all that information. And if you have anything else coming up, make sure you tell them about how they can get your book as well.
Okay. Well, the website again is the PeabodyPractice.com, and that has all of the contact information. If you order the book from there, I can send it to you myself, which means I can autograph it for you. And the Peabody Practice on Instagram or Facebook, and then Dr. Diva of Divinity on Instagram too. It's easy to find me. I'm an open book, and people say, "Why do you do that?" And it's because my life has been and continues to be such a testimony, and I'm grateful. So,
well, once again, thank you so much. I'm glad that you guys all joined us today. Next week we have episode 7, and that will be with Millicent Parker, and she is an LPC, a Reverend LPC, and she'll be talking about emotionally toxic relationships. So that'll be a nice jump from where we are today on forgiveness. All right, thank you so much for listening today. You guys be well and be blessed.
Theotherapist Podcast, real talk at the intersection of theology and therapy. Check out Dr. Glenn's new journal series titled Brain Dump Journals for the Busy, available on Amazon. Visit our websites for more information at thetheotherapist.com or catriceglenn.com.